I'm Scott Monroe, Food Safety Educator with Purdue Extension, and today we're going to talk a little bit about produce food safety as it relates to the home garden. Now before we get started, I'm sure that everyone is sick and tired of hearing certain terms on YouTube videos, namely pandemic, unprecedented, coronavirus, and social distancing. So if you hear these terms during this video, please feel free to scream at the top of your lungs with the rest of us. Now, that being said, let's get into our presentation. As we approach the frost-free date, many people are making plans and getting ready to start planting their home gardens. And as we look at home gardens, we really want to make sure that when we do plant home gardens, we're doing so in such a manner that we're minimizing the risk of some contamination or some pathogen getting into the system. Now by this I'm talking primarily about bacterial pathogens such as Listeria, Salmonella, or even E. coli, not necessarily coronavirus or some other viral pathogen. So in order to do this, in order to minimize the risk from some of these pathogens, we like to employ what we call the 4 W's. The 4 W's are water, waste, wildlife, and workers. If you focus in these areas, these are going to be the areas where you're going to see the largest decrease in risk associated with a pathogen getting into your home garden or accidentally contaminating your produce. So let's talk a little bit about water. We need to use clean water. Now water can come from many sources: cisterns, municipal sources, wells, ponds, rivers, creeks. So we really need to know our water. What that means is that we need to have our water tested. Remember that municipal water generally carries the least amount of risk when we're talking about bacterial contamination, followed by groundwater, water we get from a well or possibly a spring. The highest amount of risk we see is with surface water, lakes, rivers, and that's primarily because we can't control what's swimming in that water or what's flying over it and making a deposit. If we're using municipal water, generally municipalities will do the testing for us, and all we have to do is just use the water. But if we're using from a well or from surface water for irrigation in our home garden, we really want to make sure we're testing that water to make sure there's no surprises. When we talk about waste, what we're talking about is manure or those soil amendments that have some type of animal origin. Typically we focus on manure, but it could be fish emulsion. It could be bone meal. Again, all of these come from an animal source originally. So when we're using these, we need to be very careful. It's not that we don't use manure or that we don't use these amendments. They're actually very good, and we've used manure for centuries. The key is that if we're using raw manure, we need to put it on early so that there's enough time for that manure to break down. Generally, when we look at crops that grow above the ground, we like to see a 90 to 120 day window between the time we put down our manure and the time we harvest our crops. Ideally, we're going to see 90 days for those crops that don't contact the ground, such as stake tomatoes or trellised peas. For those crops that do contact the ground, such as melons or gourds, pumpkins, we want to see that full 120 days between application of manure and harvest. So again, it's not that we don't use these products, but we need to just make sure we understand the risk associated with these products and how we mitigate those. With regard to other products that contain animal components, feather meal, bone meal, fish emulsion, we really need to check with the manufacturer to see if there's any type of kill step, whether that's thermal or chemical or otherwise, that's been applied to this material during its manufacture. When we talk about wildlife, we generally think of wildlife as those critters that are running out in the woods or running across our yard. But wildlife can also mean pets or livestock. Generally, it's any type of animal that is in your garden where it should not be. We recommend that animals generally be kept out of your home garden, whether that means your dog, your cat, your chickens. Work animals are the exception, but again, we have to take steps to mitigate the risk if we're using draft animals in the garden. Again, the idea is that we try to minimize risk as much as possible. So basically what we want to do is, with regard to animals, use social distancing. They are not allowed access to the garden, especially as we get closer to harvest. The last W is workers. Now, in a commercial setting, we think of that as employees. But in a home garden setting, workers can basically be anyone that is out there helping you in the garden, whether that's your kids, your spouse, the neighbor's kids. And the bottom line is that anyone who is sick should not handle produce. The idea of someone being able to transmit a bacterial pathogen into produce is not unprecedented. So we need to make sure that whoever's in our garden, whether that's us, our kids, or whomever, is not sick, not showing signs, especially of illness that could have been foodborne. Diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, jaundice. We also need to make sure that whoever's working in the garden is sanitary. Now, yes, I know a garden is full of dirt, it's full of microbes. However, going into the garden, we need to be careful about what we're taking into it. That means that if we've just been working with our animals or our livestock, we might want to change boots before we go into the garden. We would definitely want to wash our hands before we go into the garden, especially if we've just been around livestock or in general. And the idea is to make sure we're not taking something into the garden that could contaminate or potentially contaminate our produce. As we look towards what we're doing this summer in our home gardens, ideally what we want to do is employ the 4 W's, our water, waste, wildlife, workers, in such a way that we get at least a significant decrease in the risk of something getting into our produce or the risk of contamination by a bacterial pathogen. If you'd like to learn more about produce food safety in both the commercial setting and the home garden, be sure to check out our additional resources at www.safeproduceindiana.com. Again, I'm Scott Monroe, Food Safety Educator with Purdue Extension. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to hit that like button.